right. Hello, everybody. Whoops, that's a long step down. Okay. I'm going to stay right here. No, I'm going down there with you. Okay. Once bit, but now I'm okay. Welcome to CNET Presents the Next Big Thing.
Here we are.
Yeah.
Welcome. We are here to talk about anticipation. I'm Lindsey Turrentine, Senior Vice President of the CBSI Tech Group. I manage CNET.
And she manages me. And I'm Brian Cooley, Editor-at-Large at CNET.com. And how many of you are veterans to the Next Big Thing presentation? Wow, we got a lot of new blood here. This is great. Okay, so what we do here is we try and set the weather vane for not things that are total futurism, but tangible,
That's
actable.
right. We're talking about 5 years out.
Yeah.
We want all of you to be thinking and getting excited about what could happen in a few years.
Yes, and our topic this year, as we dive into it, is going to be this idea of where we're going with the anticipatory future.
We are going to be talking about some things that are going to get better in the future. We're going to be talking about some things that might be a little bit unnerving in the future.
More than a few.
And we're really excited about all the panelists that we have today.
Yes, what a great panel. And notice that as we get into this discussion, and we've got this panel to really tease these things apart, that as we go here, we're going to see that as some things get better and easier than they are done today, we're trying to always move the ball forward, not just do some kind of a lateral where we take things we're doing today and make them techier for tech's sake. You're going to see how we try and tease apart the difference between tech for its own sake and tech for things that are better by anticipating our needs and really moving the ball forward.
Today, an example of the automation that we might be talking about is your smart homes, heater turning on based on your calendar settings, relevant data, stuff that you bought at the store on your way home, and other members in your family coming home at the same time. That combination of data might be something that in the future could make better decisions about when your heat comes on, how warm it gets.
Yeah, whereas today it might be as simple. It might be I've got my car set to a geofence, and whenever I'm a certain place, the garage door goes open. It doesn't really mean you're heading home. It means you're in a certain geographical area. That's automation. What Lindsey's talking about with a lot more inputs, and perhaps they're more dynamically gathered, that's anticipation. So that's where we're trying to go on that one. And we're going to be very cognizant. We talked about a lot as we were putting this together, is to tease apart that difference. Because they can look very similar at a glance, from a distance. Like, oh, that's just automation. No, it's a lot more than just that.
Yep. In a few years, things will happen for you before you ask for them to happen.
Yes.
That's really what we're talking about here.
With that, let's bring on our panelists, and then we're going to dive into one of our videos to start seeding the clouds.
Okay, to explore the future of anticipation, we have an impressive panel, starting with, of course, Brian Cooley, and Rana El-Kaloubi, CEO of Affectiva.
Please give a big hand for our next panelist. Joining Ron on stage will be Michelle Turner. She is Senior Director of Smart Home Ecosystem for Google.
Next, we have Doug Clinton. He's a Managing Partner at Loop Ventures.
He's scanning your brain right now. You'll see what we mean. And very important part of this conversation is to bring on the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and joining us is their Executive Director, Cindy Cohn.
Before we start our conversation, we're going to watch a little video on what this is all about. Every time you leave your house, you do something a little quaint. You turn off your lights, adjust a thermostat, lock your door, set a security system. Maybe you use an app, but that itself takes a couple of extra steps. Wouldn't it be great if your home anticipated what you were going to do next and simply took care of it for you? Cameras in your home can use facial recognition to know if residents or strangers are in your house, and eventually they'll make decisions based on what they see. The signals are all there. Image processing cameras, your location, calendar, interests, and all of those verbal utterances. I'm booked solid until a little after 5 today. But we've yet to combine them into a sort of household graph that can be used to really anticipate your needs. The anticipatory home will itself be a smart thing, not just a big box with lots of other smart things in it.
Look for strong echoes of that in the car as well, the home's soulmate. A number of major automakers have begun to build tentative bridges between smart homes and connected cars. And it makes sense because so many modes of our life are a handoff between the two.
And while anticipatory homes and cars would make our lives easier, the same technology in health and wellness can make our lives fundamentally better and longer. The term normally used is predictive analytics, and it's attracting some of the biggest money and initiatives in tech. But there's a piece missing here. 80 to 90% of what determines our health is actually social factors, not test results, doctor's visits, or medicines. These factors are often left out of the picture, so it makes it harder to get in front of health problems before they are problems. Traditional clinical signals like heart rhythm, blood pressure, sleep cycles, and blood glucose are all on the cusp of being monitored regularly. This is thanks to the products on the floor here at CES. The constant data patterns they detect will allow various forms of AI to get ahead of our health trends before they turn negative.
Then there's the world of brands and commerce. The game has always been to truly anticipate what consumers want, when and where, as opposed to the relatively crude estimates of that we make today. But now we're on the verge of a real breakthrough. Imagine a fast food chain with technology that anticipates what you'd like to see on a menu board and dynamically deletes items you would never order that dilute or convolute your perception of its brand. Smart voice technology is rapidly growing up, moving beyond clumsy canned skills to being able to listen to your sneeze and know if it's from dust or a virus. Alexa, what's for dinner?
Would you like a recipe for chicken soup?
No, thanks.
Okay, I can find you something else. By the way, would you like to order cough drops with 1-hour delivery?
That'd be great. Thanks for asking.
I'll email you an order confirmation. Feel better.
Our faces can be mined for vast but formerly inscrutable clues about our interests without us even knowing it. Once Netflix can watch you watch it, you may never get a lame movie recommendation again. Want some holy grails? Keep an eye on things like facial recognition and tracking technology. A little further out, the spread of gaze detection. And then there's brainwave monitoring, not just for medical and therapeutic uses, but to really get in the consumer's mind. The last couple decades of consumer electronics have been amazing at giving us levers to pull, like search, follow, commands, skills. But now it's time for levers that pull themselves, and frankly do so better than we ever could. There's a lot to chew on, a lot to wonder about, a lot to feel perhaps unnerved about. What I'd like to do is just to start, make sure everyone knows what the POVs here on stage. If we can start with Rana, give us the real quick, and each one of you, thumbnail, what is it your organization do? What's the POV you bring to the stage? Rana, tell us very quickly about Affectiva.
Great. Hi everybody. I'm Rana. I'm Affectiva's co-founder and CEO. We are on a mission to humanize technology, so we build technologies that can understand people's emotions by analyzing facial expressions as well as vocal intonations. Lots of applications, a lot of them were covered in this video, including understanding how people emotionally engage with brands, all the way to automotive, and a lot of applications in the health and well-being space as well.
Okay, Michelle.
Hi, I'm Michelle Turner. I run the smart home ecosystem for Google. So the very beginning of the video is pretty much what we're all about, trying to figure out how do we take today's collection of individual connected devices and bring them together to create whole home solutions that are proactively helpful for consumers to be able to help them in their home every day, get things, and figure out how to do that privately and securely.
Doug, you guys aren't a consumer-facing brand as a venture capital house, but what are your involvements in this?
Yeah, so I'm Doug Clinton. I'm one of the founders of Loop Ventures. We're a multi-stage focused venture fund. So we invest in a lot of the companies that are building the technology for this anticipatory future. And in particular, we do a lot of work on the brain segment that Brian teased in the video.
And Cindy, how many gallons of cold water did you bring with you?
I come from a very different place. I want to make sure that when you engage with all of these technologies, they're actually serving you, that they're not two-faced technologies that are basically trying to pretend like they're giving you something but really collecting data on you. We care a lot about privacy, about security, about where that data goes, and who has access to it, including law enforcement. We know that we live in a society that is not always fair. When you take some of these technologies and you gather all this information and you layer it on top of a society that has struggles with fairness, you can make the fairness much, much worse. And this has a disproportionate effect on people who are not at the top of the food chain in our society. So I guess my role here is to try to make sure that we say at EFF, when you go online, your rights should go with you. Now I'm trying to just say, well, when you go into your house, your rights should go with you too.
All right. Michelle, you're thinking you're spending a lot of your time thinking about what this anticipation could do in a best case scenario, using Google devices, but also using a broad network of different devices. Tell us a little bit about give us a good use case for a few years out from now, how anticipating could make things better.
Yeah, so I think what we need to see is the convergence between these smart devices and a lot of the services that are out there today. I think that when we look at a few years, we're seeing a home that has a lot of sensors in it. Your sensor data can be used to come together and help drive that predictive future, right? Where it really gets interesting is when you start marrying this sensor data with the services and the other things that you use on a daily basis, and to start to create that truly predictive and proactive environment that can help you do things every day. So I like to think about it this way. When I'm getting ready to go home, I have kids, right? I live in the Bay Area, so there's always horrendous traffic. It's going to take me a half hour, 45 minutes to get home. Kids are going to be hungry, right? If I go in and I map that I'm going home, Google Maps actually probably knows that I'm headed home and I'll be home in 45 minutes. Can it turn on my smart oven? Set it to 350. Can it set the house to, if it doesn't know that somebody's home? We're now living in this communal environment. We're making this fundamental shift from really individualized technology on our phones to smart homes that are communal spaces where we have smart speakers and displays that have context around multiple people in the family. So how do we start creating that environment in the future where I happen to know that this child is home and they are going to be doing this in the house at this time. I need to be able to have dinner on at this point for them because they may have band practice or soccer practice or something like that later. And let all of those services from Google Maps to my calendar to the devices in my house, such as my smart oven, my smart thermostat, Spotify, and everything else come together to just streamline how my world comes together in a very busy part of my day. So I think that's, as we start looking at this, we talk about it in terms of ambient computing, but it's really the convergence of all of this data plus services together to start solving real problems from people on a daily basis. And it can be, when we look at it, it's not just Google services, it can be things like Instant Cart, right? I might have a set of groceries that need to be delivered. My smart refrigerator knows what's in my fridge or not, knows that I need to get dinner on that night. It can get the groceries delivered for me for the time I come home to be able to get dinner on much more quickly. We look at it in terms of being able to do those helpful types of services. Also, safety and security are a really big one as well. I think that's a key touch point for us in the future where we're able to do a lot more to secure your home and let you know what's happening in your home and be much more proactive on it. And then a whole future of energy and sustainability. Like, how do we start doing things that are saving us energy, anticipating when your home might start to have problems, like getting sensor feedback from whether it's your boiler or your oven or your air conditioner that something's going to go wrong, and then proactively be able to address that before your boiler goes out on Christmas Eve and you've got the plumber with overtime at your house, right? All those types of things, the sensor diagnostics that are going to start feeding into these intelligence databases will help us be able to be much more proactive in the future and just solve those everyday problems that cause us all a lot of headaches.
Now, Doug, I think your technology that you guys invest so much in, the BCI, brain-computer interface, term that I learned fairly recently as listening to his Neurotech podcast, is the one that needs the most explanation. What Rana does is pretty out there for a lot of us. What you do is way out there, what your companies do.
Do my best.
What is it you're picking up? You're not literally reading people's minds.
Not
Or your
literally.
companies.
No,
Yeah.
not literally. Not yet.
Isn't that good to hear?
It could happen in the future. Keep you all nervous.
Yeah.
The way that I would think of a brain-computer interface is if you think about the way humans have interacted with computers over the last 50 years. 50 years ago, you went to a room this size probably, and there was a mainframe, and maybe you had a punch card that you put in to interact with the device. Then we had the graphical user interface and the personal computer in your home, and then we had the touchscreen. So we're getting pretty close to physical connection with the computer. You use your finger to literally tell the computer what you want to do. And now we have this proliferation of voice assistants. BCI to me is sort of the natural evolution of that progression, where instead of having to use your voice or use your touch command to tell a device what you want to do, you literally just use your thoughts, and the computer will interpret your thoughts and say, I understand Doug is trying to press this button or change the temperature on his thermostat, and you don't have to have any physical interaction. So it kind of brings you a layer closer to the computer and removes this sort of abstraction of the human senses from interacting with computers.
So this is very short-term anticipation. A computer can anticipate your literal next move.
It can be, and the way that we think about anticipation too is there's really sort of two dynamics of it. There's this is like a Kahneman, I think, construct where you have sort of the present and future self. So you have the present self, which is your sensing self. Your brain is your present self, and you are feeling things in the world. And when you're on social media and you get the endorphin rush from continuing to scroll through, your brain says this is a good thing. But 30 minutes later, when you realize you wasted all that time, your reflecting self or your future self says, you know what, this was a bad decision. And again, that emotion is happening in your brain. So it can be your present self or your future self, and it really depends on how the software is tailored and what you want to figure out from the signals.
Yeah.
Cindy, where are you right now in all this?
I think that there's a lot of sunny talk going on here, and I think that there is not enough thinking about how this can go wrong. Right? We know this. We know historically that that people rent cars that have driving systems in them, and then they don't pay for the car, and it stops on the freeway. Right? Imagine that's your house. Right? Something goes wrong, or you don't pay the bill, or you're not who they think that they're doing, and suddenly your house isn't working. The heat gets turned off. The oven goes up to 300. And that's just if the technology doesn't work very well. That's not talking about malice. And I hope people saw the video this last week of the Amazon Ring that got taken over by hackers and harassed a little girl in her bedroom, right? I'm sure that Amazon didn't sit here at CES and talk about the fact that that could happen, but it did. And we all have to start thinking much more defensively about how do we build these systems in ways that recognizing that they're going to get misused, they're not going to work very well. You know, the idea that you're going to be able to have the kind of control of your brain to make sure that it doesn't do the dumb thing you thought of, but does the smart thing you thought of, right? Like, like we're going to have to be monkeys, right, in this world in order to be trained to do the kinds of thinking that they're anticipating. Like, we have to start thinking much more defensively about these technologies. There's good things that could come out of these kinds of things, but I think that Rosie isn't the only scenario here, and it gets especially problematic. And I'm going to bring Ring up again because they have gone out and made deals with chiefs of police all across the country to be promoting these devices in order to have surveilled neighborhoods. So inside the house and outside the house. This information is going to be available to law enforcement. It's going to be available to bad guys. It's going to be available to all sorts of people who aren't the people that are just looking out for you. Even if you think that all the people who are trying to sell you advertising are just looking out for you, and if you think that, I've got a bridge to sell you. So we need to start thinking defensively about these technologies, and we need to have them built from the beginning to actually work for us. And we're nowhere near that with the technologies that are being rolled out on the floor right here. And when you get into anticipatory, then there's a whole other level that we need to begin to think through. We don't have the legal structure, we don't have the policy structure, and we don't have educated consumers. And that's an extremely dangerous situation. And by the way, not all the people who are going to be going to have this stuff are upper middle class people who are commuting in the Bay Area. There's people who work in our homes. There's people who pass by our homes, and there's people who have entirely different cultures, who are in our neighborhoods, in our homes. And if you have technologies that are only developed as if we're all rich, upper middle class white people living in the suburbs, you're going to really hurt those other people if you don't anticipate how your home is going to be changed, how things are going to be changed when we implement these things.
Rana, counterpoint here.
Yeah, Rana, you're thinking about a lot of this.
Absolutely.
You mentioned a couple of these aspects backstage because you're at the beginning of a
Yeah,
company.
absolutely.
Talk about it a little bit.
I'll cover data and algorithmic bias to start with. So in our world, we basically use machine learning, deep learning, computer vision to train these algorithms to detect various human activities and human emotions. And absolutely to your point, if our data set is just composed of older white guys and then we deploy it around the world, which we do, our technology is deployed in 87 countries around the world, it's not going to work on people who look like me. And so we very purposely talk about and implement best practices within the company around mitigating data and algorithmic bias, starting with how we acquire the data, ensuring that it's collected from different genders, different age groups, different ethnic groups, different contexts, right? Like maybe some of the data is when you're at home watching content. Some of it is you're driving around during your daily commute. So the diversity of the data is really important, and then how we look at accuracy becomes really critical too. We're at the very beginning of, as a field, as a machine learning kind of community and thought leaders, we're at the very beginning of implementing these best practices to ensure that we are handling and mitigating bias. That's one aspect of it. The other, I think, element that is really important, we prioritize that in how we think about our technologies. It has to be human-centric. It has to start with understanding who is the user, why are we building these technologies. We're all about building artificial emotional intelligence and enabling these devices to be humane in how they interact. So I loved your example where you're coughing and you're not feeling well, and your Alexa can detect that because it has enough data about you're interacting with this device every single day. So there's enough data for it to build a baseline around who you are and how you're feeling. And if you deviate from that for any number of reasons, it can flag that to you. It can respond empathetically, right? Like it said,
Yeah.
Get well, Brian, right?
So I think
empathy is really critical.
I think what we can, because we're kind of looking at the opportunity and the promise here, and I think
Yes.
we can. I don't really see an either or. I see a yes and.
Absolutely.
Because clearly we've got so much potential here. This is not something we're going to close the door on. We're not going to say, no, anticipatory future doesn't work. This is such a rich mine of future interface and relationship to tech, and not to tech, to the things we want to get through tech, that it absolutely could outstrip almost any trend we've seen before.
I feel that we're all waiting for the example of the thing that will change society for the better. This is something that we're all thinking about a lot, and as a group.
And that's the environment where we're at, certainly at this moment in this place.
Absolutely.
This is an optimistic moment that we're here at this each week in January.
And I would just love to hear from anybody on the panel about your most optimistic version of this, because we're going to keep circling back to the negative aspects. That's going to come naturally.
Yeah, we're about to turn to the negative aspects in a moment.
Can I make a case for, and that was the very first use case we explored with this technology, and it's health and well-being. These technologies can act as facial and vocal biomarkers for depression. The very first application of this technology was for autistic kids, helping kids on the autism spectrum read and understand nonverbal communication. We have people using this to look at Parkinson's, to flag signs of suicidal intent. So I think there's a lot of potential in the health and well-being space.
The deliverables are amazing. Or in Cindy's words, very sunny.
Well, I think that, I want to just say, I think that if we lived in a world in which that information doesn't go to your insurance, you're not going to get kicked off of your insurance, you have care that will recognize it. We have a lot of ways that systems interact in our society where if it doesn't mean that the cops are going to show up at your door because they've mistakenly understood something or actually understood something that's going on. We all have somebody in our family who has had, I suspect, struggles with mental illness, breaks from reality. There's another, again, I keep dinging on Ring, but there's others as well. A woman who saw a guy acting erratically in her front yard, and she turned it over to the cops, made it available to the cops, and the guy was shot later on that night. Right? He was just having a mental breakdown. That definitely happens, but that is not the same thing as somebody who deserves to be killed. We have systems in our society that are not fair, that are not working very well, and when you add the technology on top of it, all too often we just kind of wish those problems away, but we make them worse, right? We know this. We've been through a period with algorithmic decision making where we realize that if you take biased data and you put it in, let's say you've got biased data that misunderstands that people of we know that cops arrest people of color at a much higher rate than white people, despite the fact of not having differences in the amount of crime that happens. We know that if we run that through a machine learning algorithm, you're going to end up with 80 to 90% people of color being identified as potentially lawbreakers. I mean, the consumer electronics context is different, but these same problems happen, right? So in China right now, there's a whole lot of social scoring going on. There's a whole lot of tracking of people that is going on. They had a problem with their facial recognition systems because it did not recognize black people very well. So they went to the government of Zimbabwe and they bought driver's license data photos from people. Like, more data might not be the right answer to this surveillance state. So I just think that I'm sorry, because I don't, this is a sunny place. People are talking about all the good things technology can give. Technology can bring us all sorts of good things, but we have to have the law to protect us, we have to have the policy to protect us, and we have to have society ready for those kinds of things.
Yeah, and this thing we're talking about here, the stakes are so high around anticipation, when and if it goes wrong, when it can go wrong for sure, that this is the kind of counterpoint that is more essential in this than many of the other topics we've ever brought to this stage. Let's take this turn right now and let's go full hog into the challenges and the difficulties ahead. Let's take a look at some thoughts we've got on that, and then we're going to go fully into that area. Anticipation will be powered by vast amounts of historical data, trends, and predictions combined with real-time sensing to make assumptions about us. That's touchy territory at a time of historic consumer privacy pushback. The anticipation era probably could not have arrived at a more difficult moment.
Consumers are comfortable with the idea of cameras and microphones in their own phones. But they recoil from the idea of the same sensors in the devices within their homes. Everybody wants their home to be a place of security and privacy, which creates a major hurdle for the growth of cameras in the home, especially those with face tracking and image recognition. And smart speaker platforms clearly want to listen more of the time, and often without a wake word. We used to call that eavesdropping. Consumers will need to accept it as assistance.
But nothing inspires more suspicion than the sharing of personal health data, especially when the companies that are doing it are not a part of the established, regulated, and trusted healthcare system. And it's no surprise that many consumers still want to talk to a real-life doctor when their health or their life is on the line. And while brainwave interfaces hold enormous promise in health and wellness, they seem comically invasive to the average consumer. Not to mention hard to imagine being accepted as wearable unless they can be built into other products we already wear, like headphones or earbuds.
And as with the existing history of the internet and its algorithms, anticipation has a potent risk of giving us more of what we've already consumed or looked for, an insidious bias it would be nice to avoid. Just as concerning would be anticipation tech that limits in another way, denying people opportunities because of biased assumptions it may make about them. And if the AI that begins to pull levers for us is a black box, it can't be readily examined for errors and bias.
And there's an urgency to solving all these problems because much of the technology in consumers' hands that's causing these issues is already out there. It's on the show floor, all around you.
From Cindy to the right, all three of you are surveilling in some degree. That's not the word you like to use, but that is, at its core, what you are doing at an essential data gathering level. What do you possibly say to consumers? I imagine many in this room who are going, wow, this is a deep, deep invasion of areas I didn't think technology would ever interface with. What's your backstop? I mean, we got a pretty good dose of that from you, Rana. On the smart home side, Michelle, what's your backstop? Because your stuff's the most in market and the most tangible right now.
Right, and there are massive benefits to the things that we have today. I was going to mention like the smoke detector. I've worked at Nest. I've been there at Google Nest for about 4.5 years now. I can't tell you the number of people that whose lives we've saved through things like the smoke detector and things like that, and break-ins that we've caught the bad guys so many times with Nest cams, right? So there's that trade-off, and I get it. But every single day we deal with the privacy issue, and many of you may be familiar with like the Works with Nest stuff that we deprecated last I/O. And we did that because we were exposing occupancy data to developers who had all been vetted, but we didn't feel confident in being able to provide that level of data anymore. And we made a lot of people, in fact, I imagine a lot of you, angry at us. That was me. So, but we did it for the right reasons. And I think there's this, I know at Google, and I think in general in smart home, there is a shift that's happening right now. And really understanding we hold inside of people's homes very sensitive data, some of the most sensitive data. And we have to protect that, and it's on us. And so we're taking a lot of measures to protect that data. And as we bring more and more of that sensor data together to create this predictive anticipatory home that I think one day is going to be really, really cool when we can bring all this together, we have to figure out that intelligence layer that's there. How does that stay protected? How does that stay private? How do we let consumers know what they have access to? How do we allow them to very easily opt out? Because there are people who today, have Nest Cam IQ cameras, and they say, I don't want this to do facial recognition, and that's opt out from the start, right? So we have to give consumers control. We also have to educate consumers on how to take that control, and I think a lot of that, because we were talking about this before the session, which is consumers don't know, right? We can't just expect the consumers are going to know how to do this, or expect that they're going to understand what part of their data is being exposed. So we're working really hard to let them know, to have them opt into these things, and make it very easy for them to opt out when they need to. But I do think that is where we're at on this. We can't deliver these anticipatory technologies unless we have access to a lot of this very sensitive data, but we always have to give the users control. And they always have to be able to opt in or opt out of it, understand there's a benefit there. And for every single consumer, the benefit of that is going to be different for each of them. And some of you are going to decide to opt out, and some of you are going to choose to opt into that and provide more data, and that needs to be completely up to the consumer.
Doug, as you look to invest in companies that are on the very forefront of this, is that consideration for privacy and security a key part of what you're looking for from founders?
It is. We wrote a piece probably a year and a half ago. Our fund's 3 years old, so this was kind of halfway through our life, about how we think about the ethics of the technologies that we invest in. And I would say there's two really fundamental tenets to the ethics piece that we wrote. The first is that when you approach these foundational technologies, there are known issues, which I think Cindy has talked a lot about, and we always want to invest in founders that are aware of those issues and try to mitigate those issues. And then there are unknown issues. And so the unknown issues come from the fact that any mass scale technology deployment is this complex adaptive system where you may know and understand all of the individual components that make up the system, but you don't know what that means in terms of how the system will actually react in the real world. And so I think any new technology has that issue. And even if we mitigate all the issues that are known, there will be an unknown that we never foresaw that we will still run into and have to deal with in the future regardless. So technology is neither good nor evil, but the way that humans use technology and adapt it for their purposes could be viewed as good or evil. And I think we always try to keep that in mind. To that end, what the other big piece of our sort of ethical viewpoint on investing in these companies is it's always really about the character of the founders too. The people who are creating these companies are the best backstop that we can create and build around those unknown issues. If we invest in people who we think are thoughtful and good people that want to try to do right by the world, then they will address those issues, I think, responsibly when they come up, as they inevitably will.
Can I like just underscore why this is so important to have investors that are committed to ethics, ethics in how we build and deploy these technologies. Because if a company prioritizes, if a small startup prioritizes fairness or accountability or explainability, that's the key competitive advantage for that startup, but that's only true if the investor community recognizes that. And because sometimes it's like, as a company, it's sometimes really hard to prioritize these things versus feature development or shipping new products. And unless it's, top of mind for the company and it's supported by the investors, so I just really applaud you. I think that's really critical.
I want to take up a definitional issue. Is in this framework we're talking about, is the definition of the term invasive defined by how deep and how much data you're gathering, or is it defined by the degree of consent you have to go deep and grab data? This, what is invasive in this era? We often use the term very frequently in this era of all kinds of data gathering, but what does it really mean? What's the benchmark that says that's invasive and that's not? If I consent to any vast amount of data gathering, is that invasive?
I don't think it's
or have I diffused it then?
I don't think it's just consent. It's like, what value are you getting in return, right? Which is what we're talking about, right? Like, are you getting value? Are you, the person who's sharing this data, getting some value in return for it? Or is there some other entity that's, in control of this data and leveraging that data on,
This isn't a new problem, right? Since the internet, there's a lot of data sharing that's gone out, that we all know this, right? And I agree, I don't think it's so much invasive as every one of us has a different threshold for what is okay in terms of how much we're willing to share.
Okay.
And that is, like you said, there's a value trade-off there. And some of us get more value because we're sharing more data, and that is the benefit to me, and I'm willing to hand over that amount of data because the value I receive in return is higher. And then other people are like, nope, I don't want to share that. I don't want any of these entities to have this data on me. I want to keep it protected. And that is an individual choice. So I don't think that that's something that can be really prescriptive.
I wonder, I want to ask you, I think you're about to answer this question, but I want to set it up a little bit. I would think that in order to make an informed choice about what data you want to share, you have to have a very active imagination about what could happen with that data. So that's one concern. We don't even know what could possibly happen with that data. And I think to come back to Poor Ring again, Jamie Simonowski, the founder, said to us that he cried when he saw that video last. He was so upset by it, but also sticks by, I think we're doing more good than bad by sharing this information with the police. So there are legitimate disagreements among parties about what is good and what is bad. How do we legislate or set up those guardrails so that a normal range of human opinions can do the right thing?
Well, I do think that there is a level of, a lot of foxes convincing themselves that the hens really are down with this, right? But I think that is, fox, man. And I appreciate that he's got a business to run and he wants to sell things, but I just don't know that it's his decision, right? Sitting there as the person who's making all the money off of the thing going, well, I think on balance it's better. They're not the right people to make those decisions, right? We as a society have to make some of these decisions. And I do think that while there is a place for individual choice, we have taken the idea of consent and turned it into absolutely nothing like what I learned in law school about a meeting of the minds between two people. It's become a click to get the thing you want. We need to reinvigorate the idea of consent. We need to reinvigorate the idea of knowledge. And I do think we need a floor. I think that there are, there are many decisions. There are some decisions that are best left to people to be able to evaluate the trade-offs. But if people cannot evaluate the trade-offs, then it's not really fair as a society to do this. Nobody sells you a car and then sends you out to try to figure out what brakes you ought to buy, right? Like we require people selling these devices to make sure they are safe for us, and we don't let them sell them unless they don't. So we're beginning to see some experiments in what the standard is for collecting of data. We've got the General Data Privacy Regulation, the GDPR in Europe. California is just launching its new California Consumer Privacy Act. There's probably going to be a second one. And we're beginning to experiment with what public policy and law ought to look like, what accountability ought to look like, what does it mean if it goes wrong, and who's responsible for it is a question that right now is a lot of shrugging going on, and we need to actually create we have mechanisms to create accountability in other parts of our world, and we need to begin to bring them into some of this space around data. So I think that it's fair to give consumers control. When you ask what's invasive, I think that oftentimes privacy gets married into the idea of secrecy, and I don't think privacy and secrecy are the same thing. I think privacy is about control and over who has access to information, not what information is shared.
It's interesting that you brought up, Cindy, is this idea of awareness and comprehension of what we're even talking about for the average consumer. This room gets it. You're not normal. When the average consumer can't even pronounce half this stuff. No disrespect to them. They're not stupid. They're busy. They have lives to live. They're not going to sit down and get a Consumer Electronics 101 degree. It's never going to happen. So how do we make this so digestible? And then my mind goes to, no, that's what we have regulators and bodies and certain structures in place to do, so I don't have to become that expert. And the world doesn't have to become all of us. But boy, that's a lot of homework. And you were mentioning we don't really have anything in regulatory. Like Doug, your industry, you're going through a lot of FDA clearance with your companies. That's adult supervision there. Rana, I feel like you're kind of in the middle. Smart home is kind of a wild west, to be honest, Michelle. So there's different levels of scout leaders here in terms of the industries you're in and who's overseeing you. And it varies.
So we're part, with EFF and Google, we're part of the Partnership on AI Consortium, which was started by the tech giants and stakeholders like ACLU and Amnesty International. And I love it. We have a lot of work to do. We were just talking about that backstage. But what I love about it is it brings together all these stakeholders that typically do not talk with each other, right? Like we do not typically engage with EFF, but through the Partnership on AI, we are in these conversations on how to advance fairness, accountability, transparency, so that we're not all consenting to things we don't know. We don't know who has the data, what is it being used for. And so I think that's a great way to advance this.
And most important to me, I didn't even know that consortium existed. So that's news to me, that you were at least in the pool with them.
Yes. A little bit. I think that there is a big question, right? I mean, there's a long history of business for social responsibility type plays that end up being just whitewashing of what businesses want. I think the Partnership on AI was started with very good intentions, and we will see if it can, if it can.
I told you, gallons of cold water. Gallons of cold water.
Yeah, can actually. Well, look, this isn't my first rodeo, right? Like
yeah.
we have seen technology serve humanity, and we have seen technology not. And we are in the middle of this experiment now. And if you are not paying attention to Hong Kong and China and other places around the world, and you're just here listening to the sunny presentations, then I think that we're all going to be in for a bit of a reckoning at some point. Like, these technologies are powerful, they're awesome, they can serve us, they can destroy us. And we have to get a handle on both sides of that conversation as much as I feel like the, kind of the skunk that got invited to the garden party.
But we love the contrast.
Because but it is important. And I think people in this room, I totally support the idea of individual founder ethics. I think that's great. It's tremendously important. It cannot be the only thing standing between us and the apocalypse, right? We need some law.
And you're not suggesting that, Doug.
No, and I know you're not. And I know you're not. And I'm not saying that you are, but
understood.
I think that there are many who, I hear this, that if we just had better founders, it might be better. And that is awesome. It's tremendously important. At the rate that technology is moving, if we don't have good people with ethics at the top of it, regulators and law will always trail.
Right.
And so in that delta especially, it's tremendously important. But I do think we need, we do need some law. We do need some accountability. We need the ability for a consumer that's been hurt by the misuse of their data to be able to hold the company that did it accountable, and accountable in a real way. And not in a, not, the FTC, for instance, is the regulator that has responsibility for this. It is less than half the size of what it was during the Reagan administration, whereas its brief and the scope of what it's supposed to be regulating has grown exponentially. We have withered some of the governmental entities that had the brief to watch out over us.
The ones that would do our homework for us.
That would do some of our homework for us. We need to build them back up again. Regulators are not going to be the total answer. We need ethics, we need regulation, as I said, we need law, we need policy, and we need consumer education. The answer has to be all of the above.
Let's, we've been asking the questions. Time for the smartest minds in the room, you all, to ask some questions. We have 2 microphones. There's one in the back, there's one here in the front. Let's get people up to ask questions for some Q&A here. I know you come from a lot of different sort of technology and industry backgrounds, so let's hear what you have to ask. If you've got questions, go ahead and start lining up at the microphones. We've got about 6 minutes left, so as we're going to start to wrap up here, get your questions together, and we'll take probably 2 or 3 of them if we want to get there at the front or the rear microphone.
I have a question for Michelle. Michelle, you were talking about communicating choice to your buyers and to the people who are using Google technologies in the home. Short of having regulatory bodies coming in and saying, this is how you need to communicate privacy choices with your audience, how do you think, I'm just curious, how do you think about that? What are the conversations you have internally about how to structure that so it's understandable?
Wow, a lot. And we have a lot of lawyers internally that are, helping us try to figure out how do we best communicate this to consumers, right? The one thing that we did at I/O, we presented our privacy principles at I/O, and they're published online, just to give the philosophy about it. But I can tell you every new product that we come out with, every new feature that we have, we are vetting for privacy, and then how are we figuring out how to communicate that to consumers. One of the things in general that we're facing right now in the smart home industry is consumer education. Just looking at voice technologies, people don't know how to use these things, right? They don't really know how to ask the right questions and things like that. So consumer education of smart technologies, voice technologies, all of that is, I think it's an industry thing that we're facing right now. I was talking to some of my partners this morning. We're all facing the same issue, right? So better ways of educating users on how to use the products, how to opt in, how to opt out. Google's got a pretty good page on it. If you go to Google My Services, it gives you a very clear listing of how to opt in and out of all the Google services you have, and it's very top level. But every new feature that we have, we discuss internally. How do we expose this to consumers, and how do we explain what data that they're exposing and give them the choice to expose it or not? I think one of the challenges we have in smart home with that, though, is if we don't get certain data, certain things don't work. Like that really cool predictive home that you have, if we don't have the data, that predictive home won't work. And then consumers don't know, is that me? Is something broken? How come that doesn't work? And I think going forward, we don't have the answer to that today. That's something I deal with actually every day. How are we going to be able to explain to consumers, if they don't provide this level of information, this functionality just doesn't work? This is the trade-off that they have. So we're figuring it out.
I just wanted to mention one other kind of great governor of this kind of stuff, which is the ability to leave if a technology isn't serving you well. And one of the things that EFF has been talking about a lot is something we called adversarial interoperability, which is a lot of syllables, but basically means that somebody needs to be able to make a tool that serves you better if the tool you have isn't serving you very well. and you need to be able to leave. And not so I know in the smart homes they're beginning to have conversations about this, but certainly in the context of social networks and other things, you really have to kind of choose your prince, and then you're just beholden to that prince, right? In terms of whether you're a Facebook person, you're an Apple person, you're a Google person, and then everything doesn't work if you try to leave, right? You can't take your data and go, or you can't decide that you want to participate with one piece of the business and not the other piece of the business, something that I think is a problem with Google a lot. It's very hard to just use one Google service. They really want you to, they really push you to do all of them in the online environment. So we need to actually shore up some of our laws and policies and technologies around creating competition, creating the ability for somebody to build if you don't like the way that your smart home is tracking you and how that information is being used, you should be able to leave.
That's the adversarial part. The interoperability part's what's so intriguing. That's the ability to leave, not the impetus to leave.
Well, the ability to leave, or the ability to leave a little bit, right? The ability to say, I want this one thing, but I don't want this other thing of it.
Okay.
And as opposed to now, where you either sign on and you get tracked all the time, or you don't have the technology at all.
Or you gotta leave
There's
the room.
lots of spaces in between this. And so while I've talked about regulation, I've talked about law, I've talked about policy, I think we also need competition to help make sure that consumers are empowered and that people who want to sell you a more secure strategy for your home can do so, and that you can use the technology that you already bought. You can flash that sucker, put new software in it, and that software is going to protect you better than the software that you had before.
Okay, it looks like this topic terrified you all so much no one is going to go to the microphones. You might be tracked, recorded, somehow anticipated. So let's finish with a lightning round. With challenges and promise and all together. Within this context of anticipation, I want to start with you, Rana, and come down here towards Cindy. Give us a quick one. What's on your to-do list for 2020 within what you do to move the ball forward as a member of the anticipation industry? What are some things that are going to be key?
Continuing.
Just a thumbnail.
Yeah, continuing to invest in this idea of building technologies that understand humans, but doing it with a high focus on ethics and diversity and inclusion in how we design and think about these technologies.
All right.
Yeah, I think the big thing we're working on is how do we move from having a smart home that really isn't that smart, is just a collection of devices, into an integrated, really truly helpful home with an intelligence layer that is rooted in security and privacy.
I think for us, it's always finding really great companies and great founders to invest in. And I think in particular, if I think about the time scale that we're trying to invest on related to brain-computer interface, one area that we're very interested in is around the ear and devices around the ear. The ability to collect data from that very data-rich part of the body, I think is one theme that I'm paying a lot of attention to for this year.
Interesting.
Cindy, you get the last word.
Well, I think that our job is to try to make sure that as we move into this brave new world, this world is serving you, that your technologies are not two-faced. They're single-faced. They're only facing you. They're not two-faced and serving somebody else's interest, whether that's gathering advertising information or helping the cops in their endeavors, or any of the other things that we're doing. So consumers are very quickly getting educated to the downsides of some of these technologies, and we want to help them figure out how to make their voices heard, not just in what they buy, but in the policies and laws that get developed.
Okay, my last question is for Doug. What am I thinking?
I don't know.
He doesn't have access to your ear.
Yeah, you need one of our devices first. I'll sell you one later.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah.
Okay, we hope you got some great insight from this remarkable panel. How about a hand for Cindy, Doug, Michelle, and Ron? Thank you, guys. Thank you. Okay, little housekeeping. We have a lot of great programming coming at the CNET stage. And if you haven't been with us in the last couple years, we're over at Sands, Tech West.
That's right. We're over at Sands. We're at Tech West. We're there for the rest of the week. We are at ces.cnet.com. And you can find pretty much anything you need to know about the biggest stories at the show right there over at our stage all the way through Friday.
Yeah, and Lindsey and her team put us on a really great mission this year. Filter de-hype, focus. It's really looking so good. Our app is, I'd say this even if I didn't work there. It's the greatest guide to CES. So grab our app as a great guide to get around. Let's see, we've got a Best of CES daily wrap-up that I'll be hosting with some of our cohorts today at 5 and tomorrow at 5. And we have an interesting torture test. Just when you thought you'd seen every torture test on YouTube, we're taking some products out to have the Las Vegas Golden Knights slap shot them on the ice. You haven't seen that before. And I can't often say that. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.